Can somebody please confirm you can hear me?
I can hear you, Professor.
Thank you. All right, I'm almost afraid to ask, but are there any questions before we get started?
Yes, I have a question.
Uh-huh.
So I saw that you put in the drop quiz as negative points to try to drop one of our quizzes, but because it's out of zero, the amount of points available didn't drop, so it just made it so it looks like I got 0 out of 0 on one of the quizzes rather than actually dropping a score. Um, and so I was wondering,
I don't think
that
that's
was gonna
correct,
get
but go on.
fixed.
Go on.
Oh, I was wondering if that was gonna get so like my quiz 5 was added, so all of my quizzes have grades in there, and they're all out of 75. But my
Right.
drop quiz is negative 59 out of 0. And so, because it averages all of those, what it does is now all 5 of those are worth 75 points, but now one of them is 0 because it's minus 59 out of 0.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
So
So you're
it
saying quiz
brought me
five, you got
down.
it's out of it's out of 75 and it should be out of zero. You are correct there.
I also emailed you regarding that quiz because my was also a negative score, so it dropped me basically a whole grade.
Now I understand. Like I said, quiz five should not be out of 75 points. It should be out of 0 points. And I'll get that changed in just a minute here. Let me see. I think we're on chapter 14. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
All right. Like I said, I just put in quiz five yesterday. You can still access the actual quiz by getting it from the main web page, scrolling down. But if you go to the grade book, you won't see the actual quiz five anymore because I made it a non-counting quiz, so it won't be in the grade book. And then Q5, meaning for the correction for quiz five, um, it's supposed to have up to your 75 points, but it's supposed to be out of zero, and I did mistakenly make it out of 75. So let me change that right now.
Professor, when you're done with that, could I ask you a question about the unknowns species list?
Okay, give me a minute here.
No problem.
I'm having trouble finding the. Oh, that'll work. I'm not showing my screen, correct?
No.
You went, all right. Because I'm going to be going through the grade book because I couldn't find the assignments to get into quiz five. Quiz five is not saying what it's out of, but it should be out of 75. I did it right. Yeah, that should be out of zero. Let's go back to the grade book to make sure that took. All right, Q5, meaning the correction for quiz five is now out of zero. And that means you're getting up to 75 points on quiz five and all the other quizzes, which will mean you have 75 points too much for the quizzes. And then the drop quiz, being a negative number, will subtract that 75 points. Any question about that? All right, let me get out of the grade book here and I'll share my screen.
It fixed it in mine. Thank you.
All right.
Mine as well, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, sharing my screen now. Thank you for that correction. Like I said, I just got the quiz 5 corrected and then the drop quiz put in actually very early this morning. And I normally have that quiz 5 correction out of 0. And when I made it today, I forgot and I made it out of 75 points. Okay, I have in the lecture that we are here. Is this correct? Anyone? Not hearing anyone. I'm going to assume it's correct. Let me go to the syllabus. Somebody, you got your microphone on. You should probably turn it off while you're not speaking. Today we're going to talk about chapter 14 and finish that. The worksheet for chapter 14 is due on the 27th. That is tomorrow. And that's because, well, this is the summer term. Everything's truncated. Sorry about that. The final is actually in 2 days' time on Thursday. 50% of the questions from the quiz will be on the material that you have not been quizzed on. So 50% of the material will be from, meaning 50% of the questions will be on chapter 13 and 14 and the unknown project. Are there any questions about any of that?
I actually have a question about the unknown project, specifically the unknowns species list that we use.
Yeah.
So I found a discrepancy with one of the tests is listed as being a negative on the species list, but all studies I've found show that all variants of the species are positive. And that was a pivotal test for me. And it led me to additional tests. And it kind of changes everything if it's supposed to be a positive result instead of a negative.
And on the, is that one that I even got colored in my list?
Let me see.
Now, don't worry about it. Anyways, there is one species which we have in the table an incorrect value, and you need that incorrect value to be able to distinguish that species from other species. And so there is one, what do you call it? One square in the table or one value in the table that is incorrect. However, you need it to identify the species. And so that's why we have it incorrect in the table. And any results I gave you to that species will have the table's results, not the real species results. So you should go with the results I sent you and with what the table says. And yes, there is one error in the table. It's deliberate, and that's so that you can separate that species from other species in the table.
Okay.
Okay.
I was just kind of worried because I was reading studies and I was like, well, that changes the direction I would have gone if it was positive.
Like I said, follow what the table has and the results I sent you. And there is one error that we are deliberately making so that you can distinguish the species from other species in the table. All right. Any other questions? That's really good that you found that, but I've only had one other student who found that. But like I said, I am aware of the table being wrong, and it's a deliberate part on our end.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So let me remind you, your unknown notes pages is closing today. So if you have a last test, make sure you put it in today, because after today, you will not be able to ask for a test request. And the other thing is the project is due tomorrow. So if you put in a test request today, you should make sure that test request can be incubated for no longer than 24 hours. Because if it's longer than 24 hours, you're not going to get the results in time. Any question about any of that? I do know that some of you waited to the very end. I told you you have to get started on this project about 2 weeks in advance because it'll take most students and average students 2 weeks to get the project done. And you're not going to have the time to get this project done. Any questions about any of that? If you don't get the project done, you should just write up the project as far as you can, meaning say you've identified it as these possibilities and you needed more time to get more tests done and you ran out of time. And then just write up your report that way. Any question about any of that?
When will our infectious disease project be graded?
I was hoping to have it graded before the final. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to succeed on that because it will take me at least 24 hours of constant grading to get it graded. And that's assuming that there are some students, actually, I think almost 4 students, who did not get 100% on the, oh, what the heck was that? The plagiarism quiz. And you must get 100% on the plagiarism quiz to get any points on the infectious disease project. And if you didn't get 100%, you're getting 0 on the infectious disease project. I've stated that a number of times in this class, and I'm going to stick with it. However, I am going to be lenient and say that you will be allowed to complete 7 tries. And so I've opened the plagiarism quiz, and you can continue trying up to 7 tries to get 100%. And my suggestion is you should not guess on this because once your 7 tries are used up, you don't have any more tries. So you should learn the material on the plagiarism quiz and then take the quiz. Any question about any of that? All right. And if you got a 0 on the infectious disease project and you get your plagiarism quiz up to 100%, I will change that 0 and give you the correct infectious disease score, whatever you get on your paper. Any questions about any of that? All right. So work on your unknown project. Oh, that's another thing I need to talk about. I've got a note here that I'm supposed to read to you. I can find it. I remember what it is, and that is your unknown notes pages is going to be graded. So you want to finish your unknown notes pages.
Do
by
we need to
finishing-
submit the unknown notes today?
I'm sorry?
Do we need to submit the unknown notes only today and then the project tomorrow?
You can submit both today. The project has to be submitted by tomorrow. The unknown notes page, your last chance for changing it or adding anything to it, will be 11:59 p.m. tonight. Okay? Anyways, it is graded, so you should finish it, meaning you should put in your last test results that I sent to you and give your statements about what you're supposed to be giving in the unknown notes pages. And I don't remember all of it, but you should have the observations. You should have your conclusions for the test. You should have what species are under consideration, and you should have your thoughts for the day, whatever you're doing. And anything else you need to put in the unknown notes pages. So if there's anything else, I've got it in the unknown notes pages. Why don't I just go to that and then I can look it up. See if I mentioned everything that's supposed to be in the unknown notes pages. Your daily activities, obviously. Test requests. You should put your test results and conclusions, as well as the species under consideration. All right. And don't put it in the comments, put it in the document. If you put it in the comments, I'm not notified when you put in a comment, so I will not really pay attention to it. So make sure you upload it as a document. All right. And then I need to talk to you about your review for the final. I've already got it up. Oops, I shut down the... Didn't mean to do that. Hopefully I can still get into it. Because once you log in, it allows you to automatically log in within 24 hours. Or maybe it's, I don't know, 11:59 p.m. I don't know. What is it? Oh, yeah. If you take a look at the my Zoom page, my, excuse me, YouTube page. I thought I had it up here. Oh, there it is. I've got a review for the final. You'll get this notice there, just ignore it and then hit my YouTube site right there. It'll take you to the site. And that's because Canvas doesn't like opening a page outside of Canvas, so it gives you that there. And it's for the lab for today. It is a review that I've made for the final. All right. The final is comprehensive, but about... All right. Any questions about any of that? All right. All right. Any other questions before we move on? So the final must be done by 11:59 p.m. Thursday night. I think you can start 11:59 p.m. Wednesday night. So as soon as it's 12:01, it's Thursday. Any question about any of that? There are two finals. The final A is a short answer or essay type question. I don't think there's really any essay type questions, but there might be. And it is, you do need to go in with Zoom, not Zoom, Respondus Lockdown Browser and Respondus Monitor. I think you get an hour to do this. There's only 3 questions, but you get an hour to answer them on. It must be completed by the designated time. Don't cheat because obviously I am going to be watching on the webcam, but it's only worth 9 points. Nobody will ever take an hour, but oops, it's actually 44 minutes. I didn't remember that correctly. And then on final B, the main final containing the multiple choice questions, I've moved the environmental scan to a question inside the exam. So there is no environment outside of the exam. Let me see if I can back up here. So assuming I've done this right, you'll start the quiz, and then the very first question will ask you to give me a scan of your environment. And I've given you 2 extra minutes. to do that scan. Nobody ever takes 2 minutes to do a scan. Some people are really, really good on giving me a scan, and they take almost, I don't know, almost a full minute, not quite a full minute, but uh, most people only take 10 or 20 seconds to give me a scan. And you should do a good job on giving me a scan. This scan will be worth 3 points this time. So make sure you scan where your environment is. Hopefully, I'm showing you where my laptop is. And then when it's down, show me the right. I don't know if you can see this or not. And I've got a whole bunch of papers here and books that you
I
should not
can't
have in
see
your
what you're
area.
doing. I can just see the green screen background right now, so I can't see at all what you're doing.
Okay, I'm just trying to show you what you should do. Let's remove the green screen. Can I do that? I don't even know how to do that. So uh, let me see. I don't know if I can do this. So
I think it's because you were sharing your screen still that we couldn't
no, I
see.
don't think so. But let me stop sharing the screen and see if that doesn't do it. Because you can still see the background when you're seeing my face. So can you see the
No.
here?
I
Yeah.
just
No.
see the
Okay.
background.
You said, I don't know if I can stop the background. I mean, no, I
You
can't.
should be able to access it under background and effects. It should be in your bar where the muting and the video takes place. It should be all the way to the right, I
You think
assume.
view? You talking about
It
view?
should say background and effects. It's an option on my device, but every device is different, so I'm not sure where it would be for you. But you should be able to turn it on and off.
Um, yeah, under view there, which is where I'm seeing your bar. Let's see if it's someplace else.
It could be the three dots that say more if you have that.
I don't have a more, not up there on the bar.
It's probably different because you're hosting.
Oh, here, it's down here in the bottom. Whiteboard, raise to default, drag to record. Bar. No, that doesn't have it. So it's not there for me. Um, let's see if
Yeah.
it's shouldn't be under share. I'm not sharing at the moment. Share.
Up at the top of your screen, do you have a thing that says view? And it
Yeah,
has like the if
I
you
don't
click
see
on
it
that,
under view though. What would it be under view?
let me see. 1 second.
There's full screen view, and I'm not seeing it under view. Anyways, let me see if I can use this one here. And then I can just demonstrate. Yeah. All right, here's a monitor. Of course, I don't know if you can see this monitor. No, you can't really. There's a monitor, and you need to tilt it down so that I can see where the monitor is sitting, and then tilt it to the side. That's not really sharing that, but very well. That is tilted to the side, but you can't see it. You can only see it where my body is. And then tilt it to the other side. And you need to show me the complete left and right of where your computer was or monitor was sitting. Actually, most of you have been able to do that. One student, for whatever reason, has not been able to do that this term, and I'm assuming this student is not trying because, like I said, all you need to do is tilt the monitor. Even if it's built into an older computer, you can take the whole computer and tilt it down. Anyways, I'm not saying how to stop the background, and I know it's possible, but I don't know how to do it. So I'm gonna
I can
go
search for it later and just send you a message.
Okay. Let me start sharing my screen again, and let's try and finish this lesson. Ah. I tried showing you, but like I said, it's only showing you the background, so um, and I'm not sure how to stop that. So, all right, let's go on to chapter 14. We talked about primary infection, a secondary infection, which is caused by the primary infection either weakening the body's defenses, such as the mucous membranes or maybe the skin, allowing a secondary infection to enter. And it might weaken the body just by weakening the host immune system, too. And then we talked about subclinical disease. When talking about the severity or duration of a disease, there are two terms you need to know: a latent disease and herd immunity. A latent disease, we've already talked about this, I think, and that is a disease which goes latent, where it's no longer having signs and symptoms of disease, but the disease doesn't totally go away, and then it may come back. Now, with the viruses, when they go latent, they usually are not replicating, they're not causing disease, they're not doing damage to the body while the virus is latent. But the virus can come out of latency and start replicating and then doing damage to the body, in which case the latency goes away and then the disease comes back. And most latent diseases that I know of are caused by a virus. So the virus has gone latent and the disease comes back. That may not be true of all diseases. Like I think you can have a disease go asymptomatic and it's not really doing much harm, if any harm, to the body while it's asymptomatic. But then it can come back being worse. Actually, strep throat is that way. If you don't remember, if you've ever had strep throat, it usually has a sore throat, and then you get better, and then the sore throat comes back. And so, in that period of time where you are asymptomatic, that would be where strep throat would be kind of latent. Cancer can sometimes go latent too, where they've knocked the cancer down and the cancer goes latent, but then it can come back and then cause disease again. Anyways, that's what a latent disease is: a disease where the patient has a period with no signs or symptoms. Usually the pathogen is inactive, and the best classical case of that is when a child gets chickenpox, they have disease, and then the virus goes latent, the disease goes latent, but many years later, the disease can come back not as chickenpox, but as shingles, and the patient has signs or symptoms. And with chickenpox, this usually happens decades later. Any question about any of that?
So does that mean if I had chickenpox as a kid, I still have chickenpox?
You still have the virus causing chickenpox, but it's latent, and only about, I think, 25% of Americans will have the chickenpox reactivate and then cause shingles. Okay, so not everyone who had chickenpox will get shingles, but there's a significant number of us who got chickenpox who can get shingles. And I might be wrong, it might be 30%, but it's not 100%. It's nowhere near 100%. And they think that the virus has gone latent, and then a lot of people die before the virus ever comes out of latency. Any questions about any of that? All right. Herd immunity, another term you need to know, that's when many immune people are in a population and they protect the non-immune people from getting a disease. This is actually the whole point of vaccination, to create herd immunity. Let me blow this up so you can see it better. So normally, when you first get a disease hitting a population, if there's no immunity in the disease, everyone is susceptible, and then almost everybody will come down with the disease. This is what they were worried COVID-19 would do when it first came into existence. Nobody had immunity to it because it was a disease that humans had never seen before. And every once in a while, we have a pandemic of the flu, which was a flu variant that we have no immunity to or very little immunity to. And then almost everyone in the population can get it. And when that happens, it happens on average about every 10 years. There will be a pandemic flu epidemic worldwide because there's a new variant out there and nobody has any immunity to it. And so it hits a lot of people, and it's usually a very bad flu that year. The last time this happened actually was in 2007 when the swine flu came back. And actually, the swine flu came and started the pandemic in the year 1917, 1918. And it's actually come back twice before. In 2007 was the last time. And there are so many people with no immunity to it that it was a flu pandemic that year. Any questions about any of that? Now, the other question is, why have we not had a pandemic for so long? And I don't know the answer to that, partly because of COVID-19. People were taking much better precautions, and the transmission of the flu was greatly diminished while people were taking masks and trying to avoid getting COVID-19. That has gone. And so now we return to having the normal flu cycle in the wintertime. But we've never had a pandemic, at least not since 2007. With high immunization in the population, where most of the people are immunized, when somebody comes sick, only people in close association to that sick individual will become sick. So this flu susceptible person will become sick. And then these people here are protected because the disease has to go to this person here or that person there before it can get to this person. And these people are immune, and so they do not get the disease. And this is herd immunity, where the herd is protecting the non-immune people from getting disease. The whole point of a vaccine is to prevent disease from spreading in the population by herd immunity. Now, the trouble with measles is you need herd immunity. 95% of the population have to be immune, or the disease can spread. And do you think 95% of the American parents will be willing to have their children immunized? The answer is no. And so when measles raises its ugly head, it does tend to spread a little bit in the United States. And that's because herd immunity is not quite at 95%. It might be high. It might be as high as 90% because schools tend to require the measles vaccine. And the last time we had it, I think, was last winter, where measles was spreading in Texas and some southern states. Any question about any of that? All right, let's move on. We can mention with COVID-19 that you need the percentage of the population to be vaccinated around 90% before it will spread. And we're not going to get that high. And that's why COVID-19 continues to spread. Let's talk a little bit about the patterns of disease. Normally, there's a specific sequence of events associated with infection by a microbe and the subsequent disease. First of all, there must be a reservoir of the disease existing in order for a disease to hit a population. So in order for disease to hit, you have to have a reservoir of the disease. And let's talk about COVID-19. There was no reservoir of disease before 2019, and so there was no COVID-19 before 2019. And then some animal brought it to Wuhan, or wherever you say that name in China, probably in the animal market where they're selling animals in the market, and there's lots of animals and lots of people in the market. And so the disease spread from an animal to a person and then started spreading among people. So there must be a reservoir for the disease to exist before it can spread to the people. The pathogen must be transmitted to a susceptible host. If someone is immune to that pathogen, it will not infect that patient and will not spread. The pathogen invades the host and multiplies in the host, and the pathogen must injure the host. If you don't have injury of the host, you have no signs or symptoms of disease. And you could have an asymptomatic disease, which is not harming that individual, but the trouble is that patient can then spread the disease to other people, and it can then harm somebody else. And a classic case is COVID-19, where 50% of young people, children, and young adults can be asymptomatic, and they have the disease-carrying organism. They're shedding this disease-carrying organism. They don't know they have the disease-carrying organism because they have no signs or symptoms, and they can give it to their grandparents, and then they can get a very serious disease, including it could kill them. The pathogen will cause the illness, and the illness will end when A, the host immune system destroys the pathogen, and then the patient is free of disease in the disease-causing organism, or when the pathogen kills the host. Those are the two times the illness can end: when the immune system destroys the pathogen, or when the pathogen kills the host. Any question about any of that? All right. There are predisposing factors that make the body more susceptible to and therefore affect the occurrence of a disease. For example, females have a shorter urethra than males, and it's well known that females have a higher incidence of a urinary tract infection than males. There are inherited traits such as sickle cell anemia. The sickle cell gene, especially if you have two of them, make you more susceptible to coming down with other diseases. Another case in point, is not entirely inherited, but it's well known that diabetics are more susceptible to getting an infection from almost any other disease. So both sickle cell patients and diabetics are much more likely to come down with an infection. They're just much more susceptible, and then probably their immune system is not as strong, and so it's less likely to throw off the pathogen. The climate and weather is well known to predispose people to getting diseases. Everyone knows the colds and flus are more likely to happen in the wintertime. Why is that? Well, they thought that in the wintertime, people spend times indoors, they're closed in a closed environment with the windows shut, and they thought the virus is more likely to spread. But it turns out it's more than just that you're closer to people who could be sick, and then we don't have the windows open, so you're much more likely to get the illness. But there are other events happening too, and that is in the summer, the UV light is much stronger and it's much likely to kill the pathogen, especially if it's a viral pathogen. A virus is not going to last long in the sun in the summertime, and it will last longer in the wintertime just because the UV is much weaker. The sunlight is much weaker. And then they've discovered with at least the flu that the cold weather helps preserve the flu virus. There's a lipid layer outside the flu virus, and the cold weather helps preserve that flu virus. And the warmth of the summer makes that flu virus deteriorate much more rapidly, meaning the half-life of the flu virus in the summer heat is much less than in the winter cold. Any question about any of that? Fatigue is another factor that can predispose a patient to getting ill. Everyone knows that when you're tired, your immune system is weaker and your ability to fight off disease is weaker. And I can actually state that if you come down with the cold and you get lots of sleep, you can actually change the when you get lots of sleep, your immune system is working at its best, and you can actually decrease the number of infective organisms. And if you decrease it below a certain number, see if I can get this here. If you can decrease the number of infective organisms below a threshold number, you'll have an asymptomatic disease. And so in this period here, you have the signs and symptoms of a cold. Come on, mouse. Sorry, my mouse isn't showing. Why the heck is my mouse not showing? I don't know. Anyways, what the heck? I'm totally, oh, there it is. Up to this region here, you have disease, but in this region here, you have asymptomatic disease because you've lowered the number of infective organisms below the threshold number. And I've discovered with the cold, if I get lots of sleep, I can reduce the number of infective organisms, and then I no longer have signs and symptoms of a cold. You have to get lots of sleep, and it does work, at least on some colds. The trouble is I then stop getting all the sleep, and sometimes the sore throat comes back, and that's because the number of infective organisms increases above the threshold number. And then I try to get more sleep to get that back to asymptomatic. I've tried to get it to work with the flu. It does not, or at least for me, it's never worked with the flu. But with the cold, I can actually get this to happen. Of course, you have to sleep an awful lot of time. I will warn you that. And it's well known that students don't get enough sleep, so they're fatigued, and that makes them more predisposed to coming down with an illness. Age, it's well known that age is a predisposing factor. I think I've already mentioned this before. Most diseases hit the very young and the very old. So the age being on the x-axis, and then the severity of disease or the percentage of disease on the y-axis. The very young are more likely to get disease than the very old. COVID-19 is an exception where the very, very young, like the newborns, are more susceptible, but even young children, I think it's something like 6 months, have a very low chance of getting a severe COVID-19. And then it stays low until about age 55 or something like that, starts climbing. And then the very elderly are very great risk. Most diseases do not follow this pattern of COVID-19. Most follow I don't know, what do they call that? A bell curve or inverse bell curve. Lifestyle can affect your chance of getting a disease. It's well known that smokers are much more likely to come down with a respiratory infection. Why? Because smoking damages your mucous membranes, and that makes it easier for the respiratory agent to come in and then cause an infection. Any question about any of that? I mean, there's other lifestyles you can talk about too, and that is people who are likely to engage in what's the term I'm trying to call? Unprotected sex with multiple partners are much more likely to come down with a sexually transmitted disease than somebody who's not doing that, either using protection or not having multiple sex partners, or better yet, being asexual. You're much less likely to come down with a sexually transmitted disease. Chemotherapy can also predispose your chance of getting an infection. Chemotherapy, at the very least, weakens the host immune system, meaning you'll be more likely to get a disease because your immune system can't throw it off. Chemotherapy can also weaken your body's defenses, like maybe you weaken your mucous membranes and then make it much more likely that the pathogen can get established. Any questions about any of that? All right. Disease normally follows a specific pattern of development. Once the host defenses are breached, disease development follows a certain sequence for almost all diseases. This sequence is similar for acute and chronic diseases. The very first, you have the incubation period. The incubation period is the time from when you first become infected to the time when you first have signs and symptoms of disease. So that's the incubation period. Before that, you're not infected, and you have to be infected before you can enter the incubation period. But the incubation period is when the infective organism is inside you replicating, and it usually has to get above a threshold number of infective organisms before you get signs or symptoms of disease. The next stage is called the prodromal period. This is when you have signs and stages of disease, but the signs and stages of disease are mild. They're first getting established. Like when you first ask yourself, am I having a sore throat? Am I getting a sore throat? And you have to think about it. And then you say, yeah, I've got a slight sore throat. That's the prodromal period, where the signs and symptoms are present, but they're mild. That's followed by the period of illness, where you no longer have to think about whether you have a sore throat. You know you have a sore throat, where the signs and symptoms are, well, they reach their peak in the period of illness. The number of infective organisms also tend to reach their peak. So the number of microbes on the y-axis, as well as the signs and symptoms of disease, meaning the worse the signs and symptoms on the y-axis, higher up, and then the time on the x-axis. After the period of illness, we have the period of decline, where the number of infective organisms starts to decline. It's also where the signs and symptoms start to get better. When a child has a fever, and then the fever breaks on its own, that will be when you enter the period of decline. when the fever breaks is when the period decline begins. Any question about any of that? The period decline continues until the patient has no more signs or symptoms of disease. That's followed by the period of convalescence, and that is when the patient still has infective organisms, but they have no signs or symptoms of disease. And the period of convalescence will be followed by the where the patient becomes cured. They no longer have the infective disease carrying organisms. And that's not a period because the patient isn't sick. So these are the periods of the stages of disease. Starts with incubation period, followed by prodromal, followed by the period of illness, followed by the period of decline, followed by the period of convalescence. Any questions about any of that? All right. Nobody's asking a question, so I will state that you don't always have all of the different stages of disease. I've occasionally gotten the flu where 1 minute I'm walking around, I'm fine, I don't realize I have any signs or symptoms, and then the next moment it feels like somebody hit me with a sledgehammer. When I'm first getting the flu, sometimes that happens. And there is no prodromal period for that case of the flu. I go from the incubation period to the period of illness. Any question about that? Has anyone ever had that where you're fine and then one moment it feels like somebody hits you over the head with a sledgehammer?
Yeah.
Yeah. Like I said,
Yeah.
something that happens with the flu. And then there can be a disease where you have no period of decline, no period of convalescence. In the old days with HIV causing AIDS, and there was no cure for the disease, the patient would normally get AIDS and then die. And so there would be no period of decline, no period of convalescence. This doesn't happen very often, but if the person were to get polio and they were to die of polio, there would be no period of decline, no period of convalescence. Any question about that? There is another case, and that is where there is no period of convalescence. And my mother had shingles for the last 3 years of her life. So she had the incubation period. She probably had the prodromal period. And then she had the period of illness where she had the shingles. And then it went into the period of decline, and it stayed in the period of decline for the rest of her life. She always had shingles every day of her life for the rest of her life. That's only happens to about 1 in 1,000 shingles patients, but it does happen, which is the reason why I got the shingles vaccine, by the way. Any question about any of that? All right, here's a question for you. When are you, in what stage of the periods of disease are you not likely or unlikely to spread the disease? So what period will you not spread the disease? Anyone have a guess?
The incubation period?
Incubation?
You are correct. And very, very early in the incubation period, after you just became infected, you will not be spreading the disease. But late in the incubation period, for many common diseases like colds and flus of adults, you're actually more infective late in the incubation period than you are in the period of illness. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. So only in the very start of the incubation period are you not likely to spread disease. Later in the incubation period, you can spread disease, and for some common illnesses, This is actually the highest chance, either the incubation period or the prodromal period, for an adult to spread disease. So anyone have another guess? Nobody's going to say the period of convalescence? That would be incorrect too, because you do have the disease carrying organisms and you're less likely to spread it because you don't have very many of them, but you can spread disease even in the period of convalescence. So this was a trick question. I won't ask a question like that on the exam, but that is you can spread disease in any period of illness that you are in. It's only when the disease is ended or before it begins that you cannot spread disease. And my mother always used to tell me, "Oh, I'm feeling better now. I'm not infective." And I would tell her, "Mother, you're speaking to a microbiologist. I know better." Any questions about any of that?
No.
All right. All right, let's talk a little bit about the spread of infection. To get a spread of infection, the infection has to have come from a reservoir. A reservoir is a source of the infection. They can be living reservoirs or non-living reservoirs. Human reservoirs are common reservoirs for human diseases. Some diseases, like AIDS and gonorrhea, only come from a human reservoir. That may not have been true the very first time that humans came down with AIDS or HIV, but ever since then, almost every case of HIV infected person came from another human. The carriers of the disease, meaning the human reservoir, could have an inapparent infection or an asymptomatic disease, or they could have a latent disease. So you can be a reservoir carrying the shingles virus, and you don't have the shingles, so you can't spread it. But once you have the shingles, while the shingles are active, the first 2 weeks of the shingles at least, you can then spread the varicella virus causing the shingles, which for a patient who's never had the virus will cause chicken pox. Any question about any of that? Actually, with the chicken pox, because the disease was not very severe in childhood and was much more severe in adulthood, parents used to have chicken pox parties where they would invite other children over to their house when they had a child in their house that had chicken pox. And the reason was because they wanted it to spread while the child was healthy, and then the child would get a mild case of the chicken pox and it wouldn't be severe. The chicken pox disease is not usually severe in childhood, but in adulthood, it could be much more severe. Nowadays, you can get the vaccine and then you don't have to worry about getting chicken pox or shingles. But in the old days, like when I was a child, almost every child came down with chicken pox. It was something like 95% of the population carried the chicken pox virus. It might have been latent, but 95% of the people either had chicken pox or were asymptomatic for chicken pox. Most of the people had chicken pox disease. There are also animal reservoirs, and they can spread disease to people. Some diseases, like rabies and Lyme disease, only come from animals. If you get rabies, you cannot spread rabies to another individual unless somebody were to cannibalize you. And that's because rabies does not spread from a human to a human. It only spreads from animals to humans. And the reason is the virus, when it gets the brain of an animal, it the virus is transmitted to the salivary glands and then can be shed by the salivary glands. In humans, it doesn't move to the salivary glands. So humans do not shed the virus. Some zoonoses may be transmitted to humans. A zoonoses is an animal disease that can be transmitted to humans. Rabies would be a zoonoses. Any question about any of that? Can anyone name another zoonoses? An animal disease that can be transmitted to humans? Well, here's one, bird flu. That's a zoonoses, an animal reservoir causing the bird flu to infect the people. Bird flu does not spread among people. It only spreads among birds, and that's because in birds, the virus follows the fecal to oral route, and it spreads among birds because birds are not very clean when they eat, but it doesn't tend to spread among humans because the flu in humans has to be respiratory, and bird flu is not respiratory. There are also non-living reservoirs, for example, botulism and tetanus. These two human diseases come from non-living reservoirs. Botulism, like eating canned food that has the botulism endospores in it, or tetanus, usually from a puncture wound, getting the tetanus endospores deep inside you. Tetanus needs to be a fairly deep wound because it is anaerobic. And so if it would be on the skin, for example, the air would kill the tetanus. Non-living reservoirs can be common sources of human infection, especially in third world countries where the disease can be spread by soil, water, or infected lettuce. I think everyone recalls the recall of lettuce from the stores because it was infected with organism causing gastroenteritis in people, oftentimes E. coli, but it could be some other bacteria. And non-living reservoirs are fairly common, especially in third world countries. Even in first world countries, it's fairly common. I don't know when the last time we had a recall, but we usually have a recall at least once a year. And it's oftentimes lettuce because people eat it raw. Can be other foods too, but it's oftentimes lettuce. Oh, let me mention that lettuce is considered a non-living reservoir because once you pick it, it's really no longer alive. I mean, as long as it's green, the cells are still alive, but you picked it, so the cells are dying. So it's considered a non-living reservoir. Any question about any of that? All right. Transmission of disease. There are three principal routes by which a causative agent of disease can be transmitted from the reservoir to a susceptible host. You can have contact transmission. You can have vehicle transmission, where something brings the disease-carrying organism to the healthy, susceptible patient, and that's usually by an object, picking up the disease-carrying organism and then bringing the disease-carrying organism to the patient. We don't call that an object, though. We call that a fomite. That's an object bringing the disease-carrying organism to the susceptible patient. And then there's vector transmission. That is where an animal or an insect, or I guess an insect is an animal, some animal brings the disease-carrying organism to a healthy, susceptible patient. Like when malaria bites an infected person, the mosquito can pick up the malaria parasite and then infect a healthy individual when the mosquito bites the healthy patient. Any question about any of that? Or when a rabid cat bites a healthy person, which would be almost everybody's going to be healthy for rabies, but that's another vector transmission, or an animal brings the disease to the susceptible patient. Any question about any of that? So 3 principal routes of disease. There are 3 routes of contact transmission. There's direct person-to-person transmission, requiring close association between the infected person and the susceptible host, like when somebody sneezes on their hands and then shakes somebody else's hand. The susceptible host picks up the disease-carrying organism. Their hand cannot be infected, but they can then touch a mucous membrane in their face and then become infected. And that's considered direct person-to-person transmission. Another would be when somebody's sick and they kiss their significant other. That's direct person-to-person transmission. There's also indirect contact transmission, and that is where the disease is spread to a living person by a fomite, an object. It's indirect transmission. Like when somebody's sick and they touch money, the money can pick up the disease-carrying organism. And then the money is turned into the cashier. Let's say the cashier is immune, and then the cashier gives you the money, and you're a susceptible person, and then you pick up the disease-carrying organism from the money. So the money is a fomite, indirect contact transmission. There's also droplet transmission, which is considered contact transmission. And that is where a droplet comes from a cough, a sneeze. Oh, what else? Singing, perhaps. In a droplet, it has to be within 1 meter. And then the disease is passed by a droplet within 1 meter. And these are all 3 forms of contact transmission: direct, person-to-person touching; indirect, a person touching the baseball picking up the disease-carrying organism; and then the catcher touching the baseball, picking up the disease-carrying organism. And then droplet transmission, which is where a droplet within 1 meter is spreading the disease-carrying organism. I'm not going to quiz you on droplet transmission because you can pick up the disease-carrying organism beyond 1 meter. That would be right here. You can see the droplets right there. You're less likely to get it from beyond 1 meter, but you're still able to get it from more than 1 meter. And that more than 1 meter is considered airborne transmission, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And that's why I'm not going to quiz you on droplet versus airborne transmission, because it's somewhat arbitrary, that 1 meter. The only thing that's not arbitrary is that when somebody sneezes, you have more droplets within 1 meter than beyond 1 meter. But you're still capable of coming down with the disease, and so it's still the same sneeze. So I'm not going to quiz you on droplet transmission versus airborne transmission. Any question on that? Okay, vehicle transmission is transmission by an inanimate reservoir. That can be food, water, body fluids. There are 3 types of vehicle transmission. There's waterborne transmission, where the water is transmitting the disease. This happens more often in third world countries, where you can have the water contaminated by sewage, and then the disease-carrying organism gets in the water. In first world countries, waterborne transmission is very rare. You can also have vehicle transmission by foodborne transmission, and that is where somebody is sick, handles your food. Maybe they decided to go into work today, and they just took, what do you call it, decongestants or something while they're working, and they touch your food, the foodborne organisms get on your food, then you consume your food, and then you get vehicle transmission by foodborne transmission. In the food industry, if you're sick, you're not supposed to work. And that's because to prevent foodborne transmission. There's also airborne transmission, and we've already mentioned that. That's when the droplet travels more than 1 meter. You can get infected by that. It's from the same sneeze, and that's why I'm not going to quiz you on the difference between airborne transmission, which is vehicle transmission, and then droplet transmission is contact transmission. Any question about any of that? Foodborne transmission can happen by somebody who's sick handling your food, especially if the food is undercooked, poorly stored, or unsanitarily handling. That's why people wear gloves, especially in the fast food industry when they're handling food. And that's to prevent foodborne transmission. Vector transmission is where an animal carries the disease-carrying organism to the susceptible host, the susceptible person. The vector is usually an animal, but most important group of vectors are the arthropods, especially the biting fleas, ticks, and mosquitoes. But there can be other animals like a fly. Vector transmission can happen in 2 forms. There's mechanical transmission and biological transmission. Mechanical transmission is passive. The fly picks up the disease-carrying organisms on its feet passively, and then the fly lands on some food, carrying the disease-carrying organism, once again passively, to the food. And then the food is eaten by the person, and the person picks up the disease-carrying organism from the feet of the fly. Mechanical transmission. Any questions about mechanical transmission? Happens passively. There's also biological transmission, and this is where the pathogen reproduces inside the animal. So the pathogen is reproducing inside the vector as well as reproducing inside the human. Malaria is a very good example of biological transmission. Everybody knows that people become sick when malaria is reproducing in the patient, and that causes the disease malaria. But when the mosquito bites the patient, they can pick up the malaria parasite. The malaria parasite then can infect the mosquito and then reproduce inside the mosquito. And so malaria is the classic case of biological transmission. Any question about vector transmission? If not, let's talk about nosocomial infections. Nosocomial infections are actually one of the most important topics you can learn in microbiology if you're going to work in the healthcare industry. A nosocomial infection is also called a healthcare acquired infection, where the patient was healthy until they came into the hospital or hospital-like environment, and then they pick up the nosocomial infective agent while they're staying in the hospital or hospital-like environment. And then the infection causes the nosocomial infection in the patient. Any question about that? So the patient never had the disease, never had exposure to the nosocomial infective agent until they checked themselves into the hospital or hospital-like environment. By hospital-like environment, we mean I don't know if you have a walk-in clinic where you're staying there, or a nursing home or a rehabilitation home, something like that. Obviously, you check yourself into a hospital. That's the place where a nosocomial infection agent can happen. Nosocomial or hospital-acquired infections happen as a result of the hospital stay. The patient did not have them before checking into the facility. It happens to 5 to 15% of all hospital patients in the United States come down with a nosocomial infection. This is 2 million people per year in the United States, causing 20,000 deaths per year in the United States. Before COVID-19, nosocomial infections were the 8th leading cause of death in the United States. It may be the 9th leading cause of death now because COVID-19 is perhaps one of the top 8 leading causes of death. Meaning this is a little bit outdated, but it used to be the 8th leading cause of death. And it's either now the 8th leading cause of death or at least the 9th leading cause of death. About 1 out of 10 hospital patients get nosocomial infection. This is from the Centers for Disease Control. And 50% of nosocomial infections are preventable. You only need to know there's a major cost of nosocomial infection. You don't need to know that, what year was this? 2013, it was estimated to cost $9.8 billion. You don't need to know the numbers or the year. You just need to know it's a major cost in the United States. Nosocomial infections result from the interaction of 3 factors in the hospital-like environment. First, microorganisms are present in the hospital environment or the hospital-like environment, meaning a nursing home or rehabilitation home or some home you check into. Hospitals are a major reservoir of sick patients. These sick patients have infective agents, which could become a nosocomial infective agent. So that's one reason why microorganisms are always present. There are other microorganisms present in the hospital environment, like Pseudomonas aeruginosa is found almost anywhere in a liquid or a wet environment. It's even found in the bottom of a wet bar of soap. Some normal microbiota are also opportunistic pathogens, and they can be nosocomial infective agents. Some of these nosocomial pathogens are antibiotic resistant, and these are really dangerous nosocomial infective agents. So if the patient comes down with a nosocomial infective agent in the hospital, the clinician orders the routine antibiotic to treat that infective agent, and then he discovers, oops, that antibiotic isn't working. So he goes on the second antibiotic and then maybe call a Kirby-Bayer test to find an organism that an antibiotic that can cure the patient. But the patient has now had 2 antibiotic treatments that have failed because the patient is antibiotic resistant, and maybe the clinician has gotten the results back from the Kirby-Bayer test, but guess what? The patient is already dead because they checked themselves into the hospital-like environment for a reason, and the nosocomial infective agent pushed them over the brink, meaning broke the camel's back, was too much for the patient. And that sometimes happens. Any question about any of that? All right. The second reason why nosocomial infective agents happen in a hospital or hospital-like environment is the patient is often compromised. One whose resistance to infection is impaired by disease, therapy, or burns. If the patient has broken skin or broken mucous membranes, they are a compromised host and much more likely to get a nosocomial infective agent. burns, injections, ventilators, urinary catheters, the administration of anesthesia, all can weaken the host and then make a nosocomial infective agent much more likely to infect the patient. The patient may also have a suppressed immune system, compromising the host, making them more likely to get the nosocomial infective agent, and making it also more likely to be a severe infection if they do get a nosocomial infective agent. Drugs, radiation therapy, and burns can all weaken the immune system, making the patient more likely to get a nosocomial infective agent. So that's the second reason why patients can get a nosocomial infective agent. And then the third reason is there's a chain of transmission in the hospital or hospital-like environment, and the patient gets the disease-carrying organism. It could be direct contact transmission, like a patient in the room with another patient and they shake hands. You can pick up the nosocomial infective agent that way. In special care units, the hospital staff, well, the hospital staff and visitors can also bring the nosocomial infective agent to the patient. In special care units, hospital staff really try to keep patients isolated and then take precautions to prevent them from transmitting a nosocomial infective agent to the patient. Any question about any of that? There can be also indirect transmission, where a fomite brings the effective agent to a patient. Urinary and IV catheters, if they're contaminated, they can bring a nosocomial infective agent to a patient. Contaminated surgical dressings, if somebody didn't handle the dressing correctly, they can put a nosocomial infective agent on the dressing, and then you put it on the open wound, and then the wound becomes infected with a nosocomial infective agent. And then there can be nosocomial infective agents that are airborne, where the vehicle transmission gives it, like the ventilation system can spread the disease. When Ebola was in the United States, because somebody who was taking care of an Ebola patient in Africa came back to the United States because they were infected with Ebola, there was concern that Ebola, they didn't know how to spread, could be spread by the ventilation system. And they didn't really want Ebola to be spreading in their hospital, especially by the ventilation system. It turns out Ebola does not spread that way, but there was concern that it could. Surprisingly, hospitals don't really prevent the spread of colds and flus, which can definitely be spread by the ventilation system. Does anyone know of a hospital which actually sends the special care units filtered air so that they don't spread colds and flus through the ventilation system? Anyone know of a hospital that does that? I do not. I can say in our microbiology lab, we do send it through a ventilation system. The air is not sterile, but it is cleaned. So you're much less likely to get something from the ventilation system in the microbiology lab in Clark College.
I don't know about hospitals, and I know it's different, but I've worked at 3 different dental offices, and all 3 offices have air purifiers in each dental operatory to help minimize airborne infectious disease because of all the aerosols that are created when doing dental work.
That's a good reason, because dental work has a lot of aerosols, and obviously there can be people's microbiological, what's the word I'm trying to say? Their normal microbiota can be a agent causing nosocomial infective agents. It used to be the number one cause of nosocomial infective agents in the United States was actually Staphylococcus aureus. In the 1960s in the United States hospitals, the main cause of nosocomial infective agents was Staphylococcus aureus. And who was spreading it? Mainly the doctors. If you ever watched the older movies, they would show the doctor proudly wearing a stethoscope on his lab coat, and it would be worn around his neck. And what he would do is he would touch the stethoscope up to a patient, possibly picking up the nosocomial infective agent on the patient's skin, such as Staphylococcus aureus, for example. And then what would he do? He would drop the stethoscope and it would thump against his chest, and then he would go walk to the next patient and take his stethoscope and put it on the patient's skin. That is no longer done. Unfortunately, the doctors were the first to learn to start preventing the nosocomial infective agent. And Staphylococcus aureus is no longer the number one nosocomial infective agent in American hospitals. And that stopped either the late 60s or the early 70s. I don't know when it happened. The number one nosocomial infective agent in the United States is actually E. coli, a part of everybody's normal microbiological gastrointestinal ecosystem. Everybody has E. coli, and it is the number one nosocomial infective agent in the United States. Any question about any of that? Let me state that hospitals have now done a very good job of educating. Obviously, first were the doctors, and then it was the other people in the hospital, meaning the hospital staff, been educated. And then they started educating both the patients and the visitors. When you go into any hospital, they tell you to sanitize your hand, and they have hand sanitizer either in the elevator or right next to the elevator, as well as outside every patient's room to prevent the spread of nosocomial infective agents. And then there's signs also in the hospital saying prevent the spread of disease, sanitize your hands, and it's been much better. And as I stated, 50% of nosocomial infective agents or nosocomial diseases can be prevented. The number one thing to help prevent nosocomial infective agents from spreading is simply hand washing. If the hospital staff, the doctors, the nurses, and other hospital staff are to wash their hands after every patient, 50% of nosocomial infective agents will not be spread. Any question about any of that? And it's true, you need to have the visitors also sanitize their hand before coming in to see the patient. All right, controlling nosocomial infection agents. There are certain procedures generally implemented to control a nosocomial infection. You've learned aseptic technique in microbiology. Now, when you go into the healthcare industry and do your work, always use aseptic technique. Proper handle contaminated materials. Have frequent and thorough hand washing. We need to continue educating the staff, the patients, and the visitors to preventing nosocomial infective agents from causing disease. And there are some other nosocomial infective procedures that you can find in the online chapter notes. Any question about controlling nosocomial infective agents? If you work in the healthcare industry, you should really work to prevent the spread of nosocomial infective agents. And it may be just something on your own skin or the skin of a patient. Any questions about anything on nosocomial infective agents? nosocomial disease. All right. A few terms of epidemiology we need to know about, and a few topics. Epidemiology, the study of where and when diseases occur and how diseases are transmitted in populations. The CDC collects and analyzes U.S. epidemiological information. For all notifiable diseases, those are diseases that physicians and I think other healthcare workers are required by law to report. The state has a list of diseases that are notifiable diseases, and if a clinician sees a patient with that disease, they have to notify the local county authorities. So you would notify normally Clark County first, the what do they call the health offices in Clark County. The health offices in Clark County send it to the health offices in Olympia, the state office for the health, and then the Olympia offices, meaning the state offices, send it to the Center for Disease Control, which is actually in Atlanta, Georgia, is where it's sent. And then the Center for Disease Control collects it, analyzes all the U.S. epidemiological information, and then publishes it weekly in the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, which is called MMWR because Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report is just too much of a mouthful to say. You can find that at the Centers for Disease Control at www.cdc.gov. And let's see if I can even find it. It used to be easy to find. It's harder to find now. So we'll do a search. Here we go. And there it is. Homepage for the MMWR, Morbidity and Weekly Report. For August 21st, 2025. There's a salmonella outbreak. Link to the bearded dragon right there. Didn't hear about that. Salmonella is a bacteria found in birds and reptiles. It's not usually found in the gut or the intestines of an animal. And 18 of the cases were exposed to the bearded dragons. Okay. Any question about any of that? Salmonella is a disease that has to be reported. I don't know about this one because Salmonella Cotham is probably not a bacteria that normally causes disease in humans. All right, we're done there. Any question about any of that? All right, morbidity is the incidence of a specific notifiable disease. The morbidity rate is the number of people affected in relation to the total population in a given time period. So the morbidity rate is the total number of people with disease in a given time. The mortality rate is the deaths from a notifiable disease. The mortality rate, the number of deaths from a disease in relation to the population in a given period of time. Any question about anything? Any questions about epidemiology or chapter 14, Principles of Disease and Epidemiology? If not, I'm done with the lesson Any questions about anything with the final?
Nice. Can I just go over real quick? So you said 50% of the final will be on chapter 13 and 14 and 50% on the unknowns?
No, no, no.
Oh, sorry.
50% will be on chapter 13, 14, and the unknown project.
Oh, okay.
Okay. 50% of the exam will be on other material. And I go through the other material, so I'm not going to say much in the review.
Okay.
But I will say there are no questions from chapter 2. There are questions from every other chapter and every other lab. There's at least one question from every other chapter and every other lab. Okay.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
All right. All right. If there's
Will
no
you
questions.
will you be unlocking this
Oh, yeah,
so
the
it's available?
slideshow. Yeah, I will unlock that. Thanks for the reminder.
Thank you.
I'll do that right now before I leave you. Any other questions? All right, if that's it, I'm going to say goodbye and log on.
Goodbye.
Bye. Good luck on your exam.